Well, when I first started performing, and I didn't know anything about performance art. There was a phrase, performance art, in the art world, which I wasn't really familiar with at that time. I'd come from the theater world before I got into performing myself, and I always consider myself a theater performer. So to me, performance is anything done with purpose and style. That was a phrase I came up with right at the beginning when I was doing work with these people. So I figured we could go out there and do whatever we wanted to do, and your own personality, your own style of how you did it or what you wanted to do, that was what made it different. And I call myself a theater performer because in theater you want to make something happen. So you have to have a change from the beginning to the end. So I always thought that if I were going out there going to do a show, I was going to be somebody different at the end of the show than I was at the beginning. That was part of the reason for all the changes I went through, but part of the but in a play, when you go see a play, it starts one place, and then unless there's some change by the end, there's no play. Something has to happen. So I always wanted to make something happen in my shows. And so when I went around the world and I tried to introduce myself to these various places where I wanted to perform in Tokyo or Hong Kong or the Philippines, I'd say I'm a theater performer. I come from La Mama, New York. I was a playwright before I became a performer. They all understood what that meant because I was just alternative theater back then, even though they didn't even use the word alternative back then. By the time I got back to New York City, there were a few people around like Paul Zaloom and Stuart Sherman, for example, who were doing shows on the street or doing shows with props, and people said, oh, they're performance artists. And it came from the art world, the idea of doing a performance, but mostly a lot of those were time-based. A lot of those were things where people would stand around and do things which was a little bit different from what I was doing, but at the same time we kind of all got put in the same basket, which was okay with me. I didn't care what they called me. I was doing my shows. I was the only person doing shows opening up for bands in clubs because my manager managed bands and put me at the Irving Plaza where I could open for, I opened for the Stranglers on Halloween. I opened for James Brown twice. I opened for a lot of different groups that would come there from England, part of that new wave music scene. I opened for the Police. And that made me a little bit different than them, but we were all the same. Karen Finley used to be a bartender at I forget the name of the club, but you'll remember it in a minute. And she started doing shows at that club. I've lost my track on that one. But anyway, the point of it is, during that period of time in the early 80s, a lot was happening in the Lower East Side and downtown, and people could go out and do whatever they wanted. And there were clubs opening, there were art galleries opening in the Lower East Side. Every week there'd be 2 or 3 new art galleries. Every week there'd be 2 or 3 new clubs. There was Limbo, and these were not the off-Broadway theaters either. These were new places where you'd go in and there'd be a band, there might be an art show, and then there'd be a performance, and then there'd be dancing until 4 in the morning. And so that was what was happening. It was really a golden era for people who were into doing some kind of performance, didn't yet necessarily know how to get gigs uptown or in fancier places or gigs that would happen 6 months from now. They wanted to do a show right then. So they would go, I mean, I know a lot of people went to the Pyramid and said, I'd like to do something. They'd say, okay, come in Friday night, you can do the 8 o'clock show or whatever it was. So that was what was happening. We were called performance artists. Then, now you have to go during the 80s, it kind of caught on. And people started thinking, that's pretty interesting, and it was a golden era because these places around the United States opened up where you could go and do these shows, other venues. You could go to colleges, you could talk, and you could do workshops, and it was a new thing. They even started having classes in performance art. People taught classes. I mean, now there's a history to the thing. So now you go through the 90s, and there's performance art all over the world. It's all one big thing. Rosalie Goldberg has a thing called Performa, which is here 4 or 5 years now. It's held in different places, but last year was here in New York. And so performance art now is a much wider area and involves a lot of the art world as well as the performance world, and involves, again, basically, when you get right down to it, people doing whatever they want to do with purpose and style. The technology has gotten involved, and there's a lot of other things that are not necessarily the kind of things you would see in front of a band, let's say, if you were going to a club. But at the same time, it's a way of creative expression. So I would have to say the idea has obviously caught on, and the idea is really enlarged to a great extent all over the world, so that anybody that wants to do something creative in the way of a performance, in the way of some other people, not just in your room, or not just for a class, but for a larger group of people, for strangers, whether it's on the street or it's in an auditorium, or it's in a hallway, that's okay. That's just a new, greater form of expression. And now that we have YouTube, people are putting those on television. People are seeing these things. I think a lot of what YouTube to me is, God, it would have been great if I'd had it back then, because there was a lot going on and it would have been on YouTube the next day. Well, this started at La Mama in the 80s. I became the La Mama holiday host, and I do a show there every holiday. It could be Thanksgiving or Halloween or Christmas or Mother's Day, St. Patrick's Day, whatever, when there was a time on a Monday night, and I would have a variety show where I would do an act and I would introduce some other acts. And we were very fortunate at that time. I introduced the Blue Man Group and Ethel Eichelberger and Reno and a lot of other people to the La Mama audiences. At the same time, I was doing my full moon shows, which I always have done since the early 70s, once a month, dedicated to Luna Macaroona, the moon goddess. And I would do these full moon shows, which were also variety shows, and I would do a full moon show on the night of the full moon, and have other people perform also. I think I did one, maybe, Jim, that you saw at Dixon Place. Julie Atlas Muse and Mangina and Jonathan Ames were in one that I did last year. And so I like doing these reviews, as you call them, the variety shows. It's just like vaudeville. Everybody has about 10 or 15 minutes to do a show. You get a variety of acts. I always like doing them. I don't have one scheduled for this fall because I'm doing these other things. I've got these 3 other shows coming up. But I always like, when we did the full moon shows at PS122, the other acts were Dance Noise and Joe Andres, who would do a dance film combination bit, and Mimi Gazy, and then we would have people like John Kelly as a guest artist, or Steve and Mark, which was Steve Buscemi and Mark Boone Jr. They had a comedy act, or Judith Renley, who had a dance act. The point of it always was put on a show. We're going to ask people to pay $10 or whatever it is to come in and see us. We want to give them a good show. And we tried our best to give them a good show, and I always try the same thing now to do that. As far as getting people to be in the show right now, I can't think right at this moment who I would ask, but there's plenty of people out there doing the same thing that I've done with their own shows. It's just that they're out in Williamsburg or Bushwick or other places. The scene has kind of moved out from New York City and Lower Manhattan, Lower East Side, more than before. So that's something to be aware of. Dumbo's got a new space. Galapagos used to be out there in Williamsburg. Now it's in Dumbo. Earl Dax has a show. He'll put on a show with a lot of different acts. And I'll go see the shows, but they're all over. You just have to look. Well, I don't know what you're interested in hearing, but the only thing I can say about my choice of becoming a performance artist, it didn't start out that way. I started out as a playwright at La Mama in the 60s, never thinking I could ever get up on stage in front of people. I completely idolized actors and thought, my God, I don't know how do they do it. I was a playwright in the back of the theater, and then I worked with John Vaccaro's Playhouse of the Ridiculous, and I saw what could be done with people who hadn't had theatrical experience, but I could never perform in New York. I had to get away to Seattle with some other people and start there. And so the only thing I can say is that you can do whatever you want to do. The whole world is open to people who come with new forms of creativity. If you look at the art scene right now, you'll see that's true. If you look at the dance scene, that's also true. And it certainly is true in performance and music as well. So the arts are out there. Make up your own.